Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third dream session, which is regarding intercultural communication. I'm Luisa Giseotu. We have met in the previous dream session when I was introducing a bit of information about my projects. Να σας πω λίγο για τον background μου. Γενικά, τελείωσα κοινωνιολογία και πολιτικές επιστήμες στην Αγγλία και θα δουλειά στη C.I.P ως project manager στο Global Education Department, όπου και τα projects μου αφορούν περισσότερο humanitarian affairs και έχουν να κάνουν με πρόσφυγες, migrants, TCNs και γενικά disadvantaged groups, όπως και το InDesign που θα σας έχω περιγράψει, αλλά και το poem που έχει να κάνει με το teaching of a second language to migrants. Οπότε έχω έναν experience στο συγκεκριμένο τομέα όσον αφορά το integration των migrants και γι' αυτό είμαι και σήμερα εδώ για να κάνουμε ένα μικρό session για το intercultural communication for the integration of TCNs. Να ξεκινήσω την παρουσίαση μου τώρα να σας κάνω share screen. Βλέπετε, ναι. Okay. Okay. So I would like to start off this presentation by just giving a bit of information on today's agenda. The first presentation is regarding the importance of culture and communication in the field of migration. So we'll be discovering concepts such as communication and culture separately, but also in combination. Intercultural communication, the general concepts, some theory behind it. And then we will start to introduce the concept of hate speech and stereotypes, which will feed into the second part of this presentation, which will happen later on. This introduces communication in an intercultural perspective. So here we will take a closer look into hate speech and real life examples in Cyprus and elsewhere in Europe, as well as look into how migrants and refugees and generally TCNs experience certain situations when it comes to bureaucratic institutions, how they can fill in forms, and what are the challenges that are associated with these institutions. And then, since you're not here, we will not have the group discussion now. We can have it during our live session, which will happen in mid-October. So let's start the presentation. I would like to start off the first presentation by showing you a quick introductory video into the topics that we will delve into today. I picked a short quote from the actual video, which says, "Are we all equal, but some more than others?" And this is a very quick video. I'll just show it to you. It's a 1-minute video, just to introduce you to the topic.
Europe. Cyprus. The common laws, values, and principles. That's our Supreme Court, by the way. Did you know we Europeans are not having babies anymore? That's right, no time. Hence the aging population. This is where migration comes in. We need people to work and contribute to state funds. But how do member states and the EU treat the issue of migration? Are we all equal, but some more than others? This is KISA, one of the few NGOs dealing solely with migrant issues. KISA is bombarded with calls on a daily basis, seeking advice on benefits, housing, and the most basic employment rights. Very often they're asked to do the impossible, stop someone's random deportation.
Η Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία συνεχίζει να βλέπει τους μετανάστες ως προσωρινό φαινόμενο και όχι ως μέρος της κοινωνίας τους. Υπάρχει μια αντίφαση μεταξύ της διακηρυγμένης πολιτικής που φαίνεται μέσα από τις αποφάσεις της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης και τις διάφορες οδηγίες και της ανάλογης εφαρμογής της στην Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία.
Malkanti from Sri Lanka believes migrants are at the bottom of the pecking order and that the EU needs to push the Cypriot authorities to start working more closely with migrants.
Think about the salary of a housemaid. It is still €285 and even the employers think it is very high.
Kongso Cyril from Cameroon says EU migration policy is based on discrimination.
It's done in a way to uphold the status of the Europeans so that they will be better placed. However, in cases of where the migrants are needed, it becomes a matter of exploitation.
The Supreme Court recently ruled that migrants working here on temporary permits were not entitled to long-term residency, effectively putting them outside EU migration policy. It remains to be seen whether the EU can put them back in.
So this was just a quick introduction to what DREAM is all about and what we are aiming to do for the integration of these people into their host countries. I created a Jamboard exercise to kind of analyze what has been said, but you can complete this on your own time when you're watching this workshop session, and then we can just discuss this when we have the live session, so that it can be a more interactive exercise and we can just discuss each other's responses regarding these 3 questions. I also added them here, so while you're watching the video, you can think of what this makes you feel. So we'll just keep this exercise and have this later on during our live session. So before we move on to discuss intercultural communication and the specifics around it, I would like to present some basic migrant information statistics to you. This is from 2020, which will be useful to understand during our upcoming discussion and presentation of the topics. This is a graph showing the percentage of asylum seekers in Cyprus currently. So it's these are updated statistics so that you can see that most asylum seekers come from Syria, holding 25% of all the TCNs in Cyprus. Then second place is India, Cameroon, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Nepal, and finally Georgia. There is also a considerable percentage of asylum seekers coming from other countries, so we just group them there. And then we can see some statistics regarding domestic workers in Cyprus. You can see that
we also have many from Bangladesh, right?
For domestic workers.
Sure, but on Saturday that we were trying to recruit some of the third country nationals for DREAM. Many of them, I mean, all of them were from Bangladesh, and my students in EFIVO's project that presented the previous time were in Bangladesh, but maybe they're not within domestic.
Maybe yes, and maybe also statistics haven't been very updated, or maybe they used to be a slightly significant percentage, but now they're not that much. It depends on how the statistics are recorded, but these are official statistics, and this was done, retrieved from a study from UCLAN in 2020. So I guess this is more updated. I'm not sure what the current situation is with people from Bangladesh. It shows that people are mostly
I mentioned it on Saturday. We were at a youth festival with Rafaela, and we have recruited our first 30 third country nationals, and they're really looking forward for starting the DREAM, and they were asking about what it's about, when it's starting, etc. So this is good news for the progress of the project. Yes.
It's great news, and we are still also trying to recruit more. You can also think about how you can share this yourselves after you've watched all these sessions and understood better what Dream is all about. So you can start also thinking about how to recruit them. Just to give a quick recap of this graph, it shows that most domestic workers come from the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, and Vietnam. Yeah, we have. Yoria, can you take care of it? Okay. So yes, most of them come from the Philippines. And then I just wanted to show you this graph just to get an idea about the kinds of statistics in Cyprus. And I showed statistics only for domestic workers and asylum seekers because these are the groups that are mostly common in Cyprus. So in order to understand the importance of culture and communication in migration, firstly, we need to be able to understand culture as a separate concept and communication as a concept itself. So communication is very central to our lives, and it is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. So if you can imagine, social participation happens through communication, and so does integration. This is done both through public and private communication between individuals. Here, it is important to note that communication is a very complex, labile, yet extremely powerful system. Communication is also a very multifaceted process. It can be achieved through words, so verbal communication, body language. This includes facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, mouth and lip movements, posture, proximity, the way of moving the body. It can also be achieved through images, so through colors, forms, shapes, or symbols in a certain environment, and many things among others. So there are 4 types of communicative resources according to Klein et al. We have verbal, paraverbal, nonverbal, and visual communication. Verbal communication, as previously mentioned, corresponds to linguistic patrimony. So these are the messages that are expressed in words. The words, the sentences, and the construction of the whole discourse are relevant when it comes to verbal communication. In terms of paraverbal communication, this is regarding the voice. So this is how words, sentences, and discourses are perceived through the interplay of pauses, volume, pitch registers, intonation contours, speed, how you stress these words, and rhythm, among others. Nonverbal communication is what we call, in simple terms, body language. So this is the visible behavior which transmits intentional or unintentional messages to the receiver without using words. So this is the use of body language, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, the proximity you have to the other person. And then finally, we have visual communication, which refers to colors, forms, and symbols that the interlocutor wears or brings with them during the communicative encounter. We also have different planes of communication. So objective content is what the sender intends to communicate to the receiver. We have self-revelation, which is the information that the sender reveals about him or herself. We have intentions, which are the objectives the sender wants to obtain from the receiver. And then the relationship, which is the information about the relation between the sender and the receiver. When it comes to these planes of communication, we often see that many barriers can come in the way of achieving successful communication between the receiver and the sender. This happens when the plane of the objective content is not clear, when the two speakers are not talking about the same thing. So then you have some kind of miscommunication. The written message is not understood or not fully understood. The communication partners do not have the same level of information. So there's no way of understanding each other. Misunderstandings can happen when it comes to the perception about the relationship between the two or more speakers. When the plane of the content and the relationship is inverted, when the content is in contradiction with the relationship when it comes to the two planes. The interlocutor's prejudices determine the dialogue when only the information that confirms the prejudice is received. And there are many other ways that these barriers can come into play when it comes to communication. You can also take a look at them on your own time. And we can also discuss examples of these during live sessions if you have questions about how these barriers occur when it comes to these planes.
I think when we meet, the people, especially the Greek language teachers and the people who have already been working with this group can tell us if they agree with these barriers, if they've seen some more and how they've overcome them. Because I think it's inevitable to have some barriers up to some point. Because
especially intercultural communication.
Yes, it's reasonable for things we talked about in the previous sessions as well. So we've experienced it before in other projects, and even this Saturday we were trying to recruit our group. We've seen that even communicating some basic information about what the project is about in basic language, even there we've received some language barriers, mostly because of the language, but also because of their educational system and what they've experienced. Because, for example, some said, I've studied. I was like, well, what did you study? But it wasn't, maybe, the system in their country was different. So they couldn't name it was the university. They say higher education, but I'm not entirely sure.
But it might not be the same. Yeah. And this is something we're going to talk about later on, about how in different cultures you have different ways of viewing the same thing. So yeah, it's very reasonable that these miscommunications can happen. And I just provide you with a visual here just to get a better idea of how these barriers can occur. So you start off with what the speaker wants to say, but then as you move down towards what the interlocutor will understand, you see that communication and information is lost during the conversation. So we have what the speaker says here, and then what the interlocutor hears or listens to. But then we see what they understand, and it might be very far off to what the speaker actually wanted to say. So we see that the information comprehended by the interlocutor is probably not exactly what the speaker intended to say. And then I would like to move on to talking about culture a bit more.
Just a quick note before you move. On Thursday, on the next session, we are going to do a presentation on communication barriers in the migration field with some examples, and then we will have some interactive exercises as well. So if you can join the live session on Thursday, that would be interesting. Yes,
because the activities will be very interactive, and it will be fun to have people inside just to. It will also help you understand how all of these theoretical frameworks can be applied in a real sense. And you can use them for working with mentors and TCNs. So it will be very useful for you to join Thursday's session. So we've talked about communication a bit. Now I would like to switch and go to culture. So culture, according to Raymond Williams, is one of the 2 or 3 most common words in the English languages, and I think in the English language, and I think all languages. Maybe there is not one day that we go on without saying something that relates to culture, because it is part of us and it surrounds us wherever we go. So culture.
And, welcome Vasiliki with us.
Oh, hi Vasiliki. Welcome to the session.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, nice
Good
to
morning.
see you.
Yeah.
How are
Luisa.
you? Vasiliki will be our Greek language teacher.
Perfect.
The other lead mentors will see you later within the recording. Where are the babies?
Good.
Oh, lovely.
So cute.
Okay. We'll do our best to make it short so you can be with us.
Βασιλική μου, νομίζω θα σε βοηθήσει πολύ αυτό το session, επειδή αν είσαι και δασκάλα ελληνικών, τότε νομίζω έχει αρκετά κομμάτια που νομίζω ότι θα φανούν χρήσιμα για σένα. Θα συνεχίσω λίγο το presentation και όταν έχεις κάποια ερώτηση ή οτιδήποτε μπορούμε να σταματήσουμε να συζητήσουμε όποτε θέλεις. Okay, so culture is the languages, customs, beliefs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories developed by members of all social groups that make their social environments meaningful. We tend to think of culture as a narrow concept that only has to do with nationality or ethnic background, but it really is something much broader and more important than that. Culture can be race, our regional identities, gender, sexuality, ability and disability, our socioeconomic class, religion, etc. It can be 100 things. And cultural group identities are defined by enduring and powerful norms developed over history and taught to each cultural group members through communication. So over the course of history, as passed down in a communicative and educational process, culture occurs through passing down beliefs, attitudes, values, norms, and rules of how one ought to think of themselves and how one ought to think about others in the world around them, and how to act on those norms when it comes to each person's culture. And it is something passed down from generation to generation, not in a monolithic and unchanging sense of how one should be a member of a group. And it is embedded in our lives from the moment we are born to the day we pass. It's something that predates us, and it's something that will probably outlive us. So as you can see, culture has a profound impact on how we look at ourselves and the world around us. You can imagine that when we get into intercultural communication more, it's going to be something potentially fraught with misinformation and miscommunication, because imagine that you have two groups of people or just two individuals, and each one of those has been embedded in a very complex matrix learned from the time they were born, and something that has been passed down to them throughout history and throughout generations regarding how the world should be. So you can imagine how it is difficult to achieve a common ground where each of them understand each other and how they should treat each other. So this is something that tends to be potentially problematic when it comes to finding common ground, especially when one is not trying to find that common ground, as is often the case with migration. So here I just wanted to show you this small poem, I would say, which is very representative of what we're trying to talk about here. It says, between what I think, what I want to say, what I think I'm saying, what I say, what you want to hear, and what you hear, what you think you understand, and what you want to understand, and what you understand, there are at least 9 chances that we will not understand each other. So this is, I think, a perfect representation of
encouragement.
No, it just shows that it can go wrong in many ways. But no, we should view it in a more positive way. It's just a bit funny of.
Καλό να το στείλω και το άντρα μου νομίζω.
Ναι, ναι. It can apply to all situations, Georgia. Yes. So from this, I wanted to just give you a theory that you might have already been exposed to, but it's also a very famous sociological theory. So it can be traced back to the Chicago School, a school of thought in sociology, and specifically to George Simmel. So Simmel came up with the theory of the stranger, which almost perfectly describes the experiences of the majority of TCNs in their host countries. The stranger is a member of a system, but not strongly attached to it or accepted by the other members of the system. And it describes the notion of communicating with someone who is different from us. So we're talking about an intercultural stranger, which lies at the heart of intercultural communication. And then while we're getting into the concept of intercultural communication, I just wanted to make a differentiation between that and interpersonal communication. So intercultural communication is the communication between people with differing cultural identities. So just to avoid misunderstandings in the interpretation of the term, we should see interpersonal communication as the exchange of information between two or more people. So this is an area of research that seeks to understand how humans use verbal and nonverbal cues to accomplish a number of personal and relational goals. So it is the study of social interaction between people, but not necessarily between people from different cultural backgrounds. So interpersonal communication is a more general term, while intercultural communication refers to specifically interactions with people from different cultural groups. So going back to intercultural communication, it is important to understand that it occurs whenever a person from one culture sends a message to be processed by a person from a different culture. And if intercultural communication is successfully achieved, then it can be help bridge cultural differences, mitigate problems, and assist in achieving more harmonious and productive relations between the groups that participate in these exchanges. It is important to note that intercultural communication relies on language, whether that is verbal, nonverbal, any kind of linguistic encounters. And a key researcher in this field identified three notions for understanding intercultural communication. So this is variability, negotiability, and adaptability. And I would like to go a bit further into these three notions because it is important to think about them when engaging in these intercultural encounters. Variability refers to the choices made when speaking a language. So this is the choice of language, the word choices you make, the sound patterns you make. So you will see that there are differences when it comes to patterns in repertoire and expectations if a person comes from a typically monolingual context or if a person comes from a typically multilingual context, which is, for the latter, it is often the case when it comes to TCNs from parts of Africa or Asia. So you can think of variability in this manner. Then we have negotiability, which is when meaning is continuously negotiated interactively, as there is no absolutely fixed relationship between linguistic forms and their functions. This is due to the fact that in communication, most things remain implicit rather than explicit. Speakers need to always engage in hypothesizing about what can be assumed from what was said, and what is assumed to be given or known. So this is related to the concept of ambiguity, where meaning can be dynamically generated and negotiated. And I have a small example for you here. So imagine that you're in an interview with a TCN and the following question is asked: what is your mother tongue? Which is a very common question to ask in these encounters. And for some Africans, for example, it is possible to answer this question in two ways. One way, and in a very common way, is to say that the name of the language that they have never spoken in their life, but which was spoken elsewhere in a village where one of their parents grew up. So they consider this to be their mother tongue. Or another way to interpret this is the most typical way, which is the language that you have spoken since your birth. So communication is, yeah.
Another example that we've experienced on Saturday, where we recruited our first third country nationals, was like we had only basic questions like name, surname, email, when did you come to Cyprus?
Yeah.
And ethnicity. And every single one of them asked me, what is ethnicity?
Yeah.
So maybe it was better to say, I don't know, country of origin, maybe. Where did you come from? But yes,
Yeah,
even this, that for us it's quite simple. We thought it was simple. It was a real life example of 2 days ago that we've experienced this ambiguity, like you said.
Because they may have never lived in their parents' country or their country of origin, for example, but they may feel that they are part of that country. So this happens a lot of times, and something that can be a source of miscommunication when it comes to these encounters. So what I was going to say is that communication is never absolute, and when it comes to public officials or administrators in public offices, it's good for them to give the benefit of the doubt to these people, rather than pass judgments when they ask them and they don't know how to answer, or they just force them to pick one thing, or be rude about it, or maybe think that they are untrustworthy or maybe deceitful if they don't know how to answer this question. So they should make sure that all these interpretative paths are exhausted before they come to find an answer to each of these questions. So this is an example of negotiability, so negotiating meaning in each encounter. And then we have finally adaptability, which is another very important notion. This is in relation to how language should not be and cannot be interpreted mechanically. Therefore, communicative means and their use can be continually retuned and adapted. So intercultural context should not be seen as the sum of two different contexts, but as the creation of one. Here, the acquisition of reflexive capacities for you as lead mentors is important in order to reassess new situations every time and not make comparisons of cultures in intercultural communication. You should be able to adapt meanings and view culture, the creation of culture, as one thing and not as two different things. So the main objective of a pragmatic approach to intercultural communication, especially when it comes to the integration of TCNs in host countries, is investigating the ways in which meaning gets generated in such interactions. This can occur through context, structure, the dynamics of the processes involved in the generation of meaning, and then salience, which is the status of the processes in relation to that meaning. And within this process, especially in the context of migration, when creating and maintaining relationships, we cannot leave out the difficulties in interfering and producing obstacles. So each person will comprehend and convey particular information and significations in the way they were taught, in the culture in which they grew up in, and interactions between individuals of different peoples should not be without interpretation. And some barriers typical of these encounters of communication are stereotypes, prejudice, cliches, discrimination bias, and many things more. And I would like to turn your attention to one of these very important challenges when it comes to communication, which is the other focused orientation, which is a very important obstacle in facilitating intercultural communication. So this is a spectrum between my culture and their culture. So often when we communicate with someone from a different cultural standpoint, we immediately and to some extent naturally take the position that our culture is the norm, the default, the standard thing. So we take for granted the way things are. But this is not always the case. And when we encounter somebody that takes difference to this encounter, we think of them as the other. So we judge them and evaluate them on something that they're doing as something that is somehow different from the norm that we are used to and that we embody ourselves. So this automatically establishes that the person with whom you are engaged in is somehow supposed, like you're thinking about how they're supposed to be, rather than have a cultural standpoint that is as justified and just as normal. So you should not view them as they should be the way I am. And this way of thinking establishes a kind of power dynamic between the speaker in a conversation between those who are interacting, which makes it very difficult to mutually understand each other and treat each other with the same kind of respect that is usually needed in these encounters. And then in relation to this, we have the challenge of ethnocentrism, which kind of leads to the other. So this is defined as the attitude that one's own group or ethnicity or nationality is superior to the other. So this is kind of seen when we find ourselves in a situation when we're dealing with someone from a different cultural standpoint than the one that we're used to, and we feel uncomfortable because we're not able to expect and anticipate the actions of the other person that we usually take for granted when we're in a communication with someone who is in the same culture as us. So we see that cultural insensitivity often leads to discomfort. And one of the things that we do to defend ourselves against that kind of discomfort is to look at the things that are easiest and most comfortable for us, and we see ourselves as better than those others. So we kind of develop feelings of superiority. And cultures and ideologies that we construct have a tendency to inculcate a sense of comfort and deep pride in the kind of cultural identity that we have. So ethnocentrism is something that is very common, and though it's highly problematic, this often comes from a place that is relatively easy to understand in socio-psychological terms. So when you don't understand something, you feel threatened by it and you tend to feel superior towards it. However, we should not be satisfied with this. And we should try to engage in successful intercultural communication to overcome this. So a central goal that you need to have in mind.
Something here.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were thinking with Rafaela to do in order to overcome some of these barriers and help each other, and which is within the philosophy of DREAM, which is actually the peer-to-peer learning, and for the lead mentors to help the mentors overcome some of these barriers, is that whenever possible, we're gonna try to be two of us together. I mean, we are all extremely busy people with full-time jobs and children, etc. But it's very important to feel safer, stronger, and more να έχουμε πιο πολύ αυτοπεποίθηση. Ξέρω γιατί συνεχίζω να μιλώ στα αγγλικά, παρέσει ρε μιλήσω. Ναι, το που σκεφτήκαμε είναι ότι όταν μπορούμε στο one-stop shop ή στα online lessons ή στην αρχή τουλάχιστον των mentors μας, δηλαδή των κορούδων που είναι μαζί μας, που έχουν τόση πολλή εμπειρία και είναι μέσα στη φιλοσοφία του DREAM, οι lead mentors να προσπαθήσουν να είναι μαζί τους, να είμαστε δύο στις αρχές στα one-stop shops, ώστε να δούμε τι έχουμε μπροστά μας, τι έχουμε να αντιμετωπίσουμε, πώς κιλά κλπ. Οπότε στην πράξη, τούτα που λέει η Λουίζα, και να τα συζητήσουμε στο τελευταίο meeting, που να βρεθούμε όλοι μαζί που κοντά, είναι όποτε είναι δυνατόν, στο schedule που να κάνουμε για το πότε να παραδοθεί, τι, ποιος να δώσει ποιο μάθημα κλπ. Και στις 63 μέρες του One Stop Shop. Με τα φέλα και που συζητήσαμε είναι όποτε είναι δυνατόν, τουλάχιστον ας πω εγώ κιόλας η Ραφαέλα, να είμαστε μαζί σας ή κάποιοι άλλοι από τους lead mentors, ούτως ώστε στην πράξη να μπορούμε να κάνουμε overcome κάποια που τούτα που λέει η Λουίσα, γιατί να υπάρχουν, αλλά τουλάχιστον αν είναι δύο άτομα μαζί μπορούν πιο εύκολα να δουν επί τόπου πώς να ξεπεράσουν τα...
Ναι.
Και κάποια έτσι main documents, ας πούμε, να μπορούμε να τα κάνουμε στα γαλλικά και στα αραβικά, που είναι οι δύο γλώσσες που μιλούν οι περισσότεροι third country nationals στην Κύπρο. Επειδή έχουμε κάποιους elite mentors και mentors που μιλούν καλά τις δύο γλώσσες, είναι ωραίο να μπορούμε έτσι, μικρές μεταφράσεις, όχι ολόκληρα documents, αλλά κάποια πράγματα μπορούμε να τα πούμε σε μια γλώσσα που καταλαβαίνουν, νομίζω είναι καλύτερα.
Όταν και εμείς ήδη ξεκινήσαμε να το επεξεργαζόμαστε τούτον και πώς μπορούμε να τα κάνουμε overcome, να βοηθήσουμε και το έργο μας, το έργο σας και να συζητήσουμε και άλλα μαζί. Sorry, Λίζα, που παρεμβαίνω συνήθεια.
Όχι, είναι σίγουρα ένα πρόβλημα και πολλά relevant.
Τούτους που παρακολουθούν και τις χορούδες, επειδή δεν σε γνωρίζεις. Εντάξει, γιατί δεν έχει γυναικοκρατία, η αλήθεια...
Θέλουμε κανέναν άντρα.
Είμαστε μόνο κοπέλες στο στράλ.
Είπα κάτω στο Mix FM. Δεν με ακούσα.
Ναι, είμαστε και στο Mix FM τώρα, τι να κάνουμε. Αλλά, όχι, αφού έχουμε ήδη δύο άντρες που εγγραφτήκαν το Σαββατό, να δούμε αν θα συνεχίσουν και θα μαζί μας μετά. Οκ, ναι, άσχετα, λέμε και έτσι. Κάτι μέσα στο updates στα γυναικών, ανάλογα με το...
Ναι, οπότε που τούτα που λέει και η Γεωργία και η Ραφαέλα είναι πολύ σημαντικό σε τότε encounters να προσπαθούμε να γνωρίσουμε καλά ο ένας τον άλλον για να μην γίνονται τούτα τα encounters που μπορεί να έχουμε σαν bias ή prejudice λόγω του ότι μπορεί να μην γνωρίζεις τον άλλον, άρα ένιωθεις τόσο comfortable και τότε γίνεται created το feeling του superiority απέναντι στον άλλον. Οπότε this is the ability, this comes through achieving intercultural communication competence, which is the ability to communicate effectively and approximately in various cultural contexts. So this is a very important skill to possess in the 21st century in an extensively technological society where boundaries between nations are becoming more porous than ever. So interacting with those from a different cultural standpoint is something that is increasingly impossible to avoid these days, especially in the case of intercultural communication. So ICC involves being aware and consciously working towards understanding those principles that enable us to see where another culture is coming from, rather than automatically defaulting it as, oh, this is different from us, we're just going to see ourselves as more superior than the other person. So I would just want to provide a bit of context for understanding cultural communication. I use the theory by Edward T. Hall, who is a famous anthropologist, who spoke about thinking of culture and communication on a continuum between low context cultures and high context cultures. So in low context cultures, much of the meaning is generated within an interaction where verbal communication is mostly used. So this is described as saying what we mean and meaning what we say. But in a high context culture, this is a culture that in which some of the meaning comes from nonverbal and contextual cues. So we can say things using language and words, but a lot of how we understand what those words mean are not going to come from the words themselves. This is what I was talking about before as well. So these can come from other kinds of assumptions, but somebody within the cultural framework is going to understand, such as facial expressions, body language, etc. I also mentioned this before. So we can't take for granted that what one says is actually what they mean to say. But that is not to say that one type of context is better or more clear than the other. This is kind of a continuum, and this depends on who is on the receiving end each time. But we should take into account that some people might come from low context cultures and some people might come from high context cultures. And this is why miscommunication can happen if they think that what one says is what they actually mean to say. And here, this is in relation to Hofstede's different cultural dimensions of culture. Hofstede is a very famous psychologist, and he identified 6 dimensions that can also be understood as continuums, similar to Hall's continuum. There are 6 of them, but I will give a bit more focus on individualism, collectivism, and low power versus high power distance, because these are more relevant for our own cases. So the individualism versus collectivism continuum puts into tension the individual isolated person versus a community. So a culture that privileges individualism tends to value interdependence. In this type of culture, individual choices and decisions are expected. According to Hofstede, which might be an overgeneralization, but this is based on general studies around these dimensions. So we see that some cultures that are individualist mostly come from the West. So we see that this includes the United States, Australia, the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, Germany, etc., as opposed to a collectivist culture where interdependence is much more important. We see that people see themselves as parts of communities, of larger wholes, and not as individuals. And this tends to involve countries such as China or Korea, Japan, Costa Rica, Indonesia, and mostly East Asia. So there is actually a website online which contains country-specific data regarding Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And we can see where each type of culture is situated on a world map. And this is important for you to know because some people coming from a certain part of the world have different ways of viewing themselves. And this will reflect their communicative encounters as well. And the second dimension is the high versus low power distance cultures. So when you're dealing with a low power distance culture, so for example, the US or Western nations in Europe, we see that there's a preference for equality of status and power between the members of institutions. So when it comes to co-workers or family members or the leadership of the state, they place a premium on the fact that no one is in a position of power that makes it impossible for the rest of us to have equal status as well. But in a high power distance culture, we see that in this culture, expects and accepts unequal power relations between superiors and subordinates. So if you're a member of a family or any kind of group, those who are older tend to be more valued or more respected than those who are relatively younger members. And this tends to be accepted without any question. And this kind of power inequality can be seen in the workplace as well and in government. And this involves nations mostly in East and South Asia, as well as many African nations. And you can see this on the map as well. So for instance, when you're in an encounter with a Syrian, who, as you can see on the map, might hold the highest percentage of being in a high power distance culture, in a collectivist culture, rather than somewhere else on the spectrum. However, this is not to say that all Syrians or Arabs belong in this kind of space on the spectrum, but this is just a generalization according to different studies. But this is good to know, because every time you have an encounter, especially with Syrians, who are actually the highest holding group with the percentage regarding asylum seekers in Cyprus. So you should have this in mind, because the way that you speak to them about maybe the way they view a younger member in Cyprus might be very different from what they're actually used to, because they think that the older you are, the more hierarchical it goes. But Indians, on the other hand, are both collectivist and individualist. So the way that we treat them will be different. It will be more balanced. So you should have this in mind, because the more we understand about other cultures, the greater the opportunity we have to reach the ideal goal of intercultural communication and competence. So also when it comes to Cyprus, when we're dealing with the arrival and integration of PCNs, we tend to keep a sort of passive passivity and passive behavior towards the cultural beliefs, and we don't go beyond our way to understand and help all groups and individuals, especially in the case where maybe a migrant family will arrive and the man will not let the woman seek for work or learn the language, and they're a bit more patriarchic or more masculine in a sense. So the secret authorities might not put much effort into trying to help that woman, which will help her become integrated into the host country. So this is very important to know because it unfortunately reflects the inequalities that are present when it comes to the integration process, instead of discussing it with the people that arrive and trying to change this mentality. Georgia, maybe you wanted to say something.
You mean indifferent? You mean like we discussed in the previous meeting that you
yes,
you try not to be too involved and emotional, but assess based on the situation and give the importance that it's needed.
Yeah, and we should try not to reinforce these attitudes. I mean, we shouldn't. I'm not talking about going into the streets and fighting for inequality. I'm talking about, keeping a stance where we're not just passively accepting, not helping others to integrate into the host country.
I think εξορισμού που τη στιγμή που είμαστε εδώ.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Ναι.
So I would like to go back to language and take a bit of a closer look.
Θες να κάνεις ένα mini break 50 λεπτά?
Should we?
Απλά μπορείς να βάλεις pause, οπότε κουράζεσαι. Ή ευόλευκε τη Βασιλική.
Δεν έχει πρόβλημα. Ήθελα κάτι να πω στο προηγούμενο.
Ναι, καλό.
Ό,τι αφορά τις κουλτούρες Αφρικανών, ας πούμε, που φοβούνται με Καμερούν, για παράδειγμα, έχουμε αρκετά με Σύριους. Η κουλτούρα είναι εντελώς διαφορετική. Και βρίσκω πολλές φορές ότι οι Αφρικάνοι είναι πιο εσωστρεφείς, είναι πιο αντρέπονται λίγο να μιλήσουν ή έτσι να συμμετέχουν και πάντα λίγο low profile. Οι Σύριοι είναι λίγο εξωκαρδιά και λίγο ποθηκιά αντραβικά, οπότε θέλουν τα ούλα, τα παραπονηθεί και τα πάντα. Ενώ οι Αφρικάνοι θα παραπονηθούν το τένα, μάτα, ξέρω εγώ, ευχαριστώ, είναι το πολλά, ξέρω εγώ. Αν έχω μαζί τέτοια άτομα, βλέπω ότι λίγο...
Ναι, πώς είναι να τους έχεις, επειδή είναι το έναν άκρο και το άλλο άκρο, οπότε πώς...
Ναι, ακριβώς είναι το έναν άκρο.
Πώς θα καταφέρνεις να μπαλανσάρεις την κατάσταση?
Η αλήθεια, αν είναι live, το μάθαμε πολλά διαφορετικό in person, ας πούμε, με τον online. Online είναι όλο πιο ήσυχη. Στο κανονικό μάθημα, προσπαθείς να δώσεις σε όλους φωνή, χωρίς να τους πέσεις να βγουν εκτός από τον εαυτό τους. Δηλαδή, ένας εν Καμερουνέζος και έτσι και πολλά κλειστός και θέλεις να τον βάλεις να συμμετέχει και δυσκολεύκεσαι, εντάξει, θα τον πιέσεις. Τώρα τους άλλους που είναι too loud, πάλι με τράβεις το κόφκις.
Ναι.
Να τους πεις, ωραία, ευχαριστώ, προχωρούμε. Είναι το πολλά. Βάλεις λίγα όρια σε εκείνους.
Είναι πολλά σημαντικό που έχουμε το feedback, γιατί είναι το actual representation του τι λαλώ βασικά, αλλά σε practical terms. Και ναι, εννοώ και σαν δασκάλα, ας πούμε.
Μιλάει εμπειρία.
Ναι, μιλάει εμπειρία βασικά.
Η θεωρία και εμπειρία.
Ναι, ας πούμε, εγώ δεν το ζήσα το πράγμα, οπότε in practice, ας πούμε, θεωρώ ότι είναι ακόμα πιο challenging, γιατί ο καθένας εκτός της κουλτούρας του κτλ. Είναι και διαφορετικοί χαρακτήρες, ας πούμε, σαν individuals, οπότε είναι πολλά δύσκολα τα encounters που να έχεις κάθε φορά, ας πούμε, ή άμα είναι μεγάλα groups ή πιο μικρά groups, ας πούμε, και τα dynamics των διαφορετικών cultures μέσα στα ίδια groups, ας πούμε.
Βρίσκω πολλά δύσκολο να δώσεις την κουλτούρα, να περάσεις τι είναι η κυπριακή κουλτούρα. Δηλαδή, θέλουν να μάθουν και για την κουλτούρα της δικής σου χώρας. Και κάπως πρέπει να είσαι αντικειμενικός, λίγο και με κολλώ εγώ.
Ναι. Είναι δύσκολο, ειδικά αν προσπαθείς να τους μάθεις και κάτι και να προσπαθείς και να τους περάσεις και μηνύματα όσον αφορά τη δική μας την κουλτούρα, ας πούμε, είναι κάπου μπορεί να χαθείς, ας πούμε, μέσα σε τον τάφικιο.
Ναι, ακριβώς.
Και νομίζω μέσα με τον Dream νομίζω να βοηθήσει να μπαλανσάρει και λίγο τούτο. Μέσα από workshops και πολλά activities, ας πούμε, που να σε βοηθήσουν να χτίσεις το confidence νομίζω. Αυτό είναι πολύ σημαντικό. Thank you, Βασιλική, για το feedback. Feel free to stop and let us know more. Okay, για να συνεχίσω με το language. The language we speak or the dialect we speak influences the way we are perceived by another person. The fact that someone speaks another language or speaks our language in a different dialect or in a different way influences our social attitude towards them. So our language attitudes are also influenced by the stereotypes and maybe the prejudices that we hold and by the situations in which this language is used. So the receiver's reactions to a message are influenced by different things. So they can be influenced by the immediate perception of facts, maybe can be influenced by their interpretation of the message, by their feelings, by the background knowledge, their sociocultural context, situational context, and conversational context. And this shows that the greater the cultural difference is, the less foreseeable is the reaction and the feedback that you will receive in a communicative encounter. So in order to let the receiver know how the content should be interpreted, we usually tend to use contextualization cues. This is something that will be useful for you in this sense. So Gambers identified 3 kinds of contextualization cues. So this is verbal, which refers to, for example, code switching, or paraverbal, which may be whispering or shouting to get through a different message, and nonverbal, which includes laughing, for example, just to show that what you said is funny or anything similar to that. So these cues also often differ in different cultures and are culturally influenced. So you should be careful also when using different cues. Maybe some cultures might find offensive if you say something and, I don't know, you laugh. So you should also be mindful of this because this can lead to miscommunication and misinterpretation. So as we said before, it is very often that you see that you will have miscommunication encounters in these exchanges. So becoming aware that something went wrong and addressing it during that encounter is the way to overcome future or further miscommunication instances. So when you think that something might be misinterpreted, you should always ask questions like, how can we overcome this situation so that this doesn't happen again? This can be done through repeatedly asking questions to make sure that they have understood what you said. Maybe ask questions to check if they are listening to you. Repeat some information maybe that you think they will find more challenging and just say it in maybe simpler terms. Maybe reformulating statements to make sure that they have understood it both ways. Negotiate meaning. Practice meta communication, which we'll get into a bit later, but this is saying something but not maybe not understanding it superficially, but understanding that what one has said is not exactly what they mean, and this can be shown through their face and body language. You can also practice active listening, do some observations, maybe take a quick look around your class or your group and make sure that everyone is following and that they're not having puzzled looks or something. And also use the contextualization cues that I mentioned before to make sure that meaning is passed in the correct way. So as I have mentioned, meta communication, I would like to pause and take a minute to talk about it because it's very important and it has been mentioned in previous slides. So meta communication is a secondary communication about how a piece of information is meant to be interpreted. So the same message accompanied by different meta communication can mean entirely different things, including entirely opposite meanings. So for example, you're in a fight or something and you say, I'm fine, but you're not fine, and you roll your eyes and you shrug and you sigh. This doesn't mean you're fine. So yeah, what one says is entirely opposite from what they actually mean. So you should also make sure that they understand when it comes to like cultural communication, they need to understand that maybe what one says is not exactly what they mean. So they should be able to look at the person and see if they're making different sounds when they're saying it, or their body language is different. They're not smiling when they say I'm fine. They're probably angry or something. So that you should look out for this yourself, but also help them look out for that, especially in other encounters where they're talking with public officials and administrators. So you should always remember that there's a whole conversation going on beneath the surface, and we should never look at it superficially. And then this is a key skill to possess for both lead mentors and mentors. You should not assume that what one says to you in the same words is exactly what they mean if they have a different gesture or voice. And you should always slow the conversation down if you don't understand each other, and listen always with curiosity and interest. And also, you should also be able to reflect on each communicative encounter you have with them. You need to be sensitive to their needs and backgrounds, and respect these differences in language acquisition and forms of expression. Because as Vasiliki said, maybe people from Syria have a completely different way of expressing themselves from a person from Africa or Bangladesh. So you should always be mindful of that and respect that this is the way they are. And that maybe sometimes our own cultures give us some biases about other cultures, and we need to acknowledge that these exist and that cultural habits can influence our way of communicating. So you should always, when guiding mentors and guiding TCNs, you should always be mindful of how to interact with them, and be aware of these factors that will influence the way you communicate with them. And slowly, I'm ending the presentation, and I would like to lead to a very important topic that we will maybe analyze better in the second presentation. And this is regarding inclusive communication, which refers to hate speech and stereotypes used. I will present this in a more theoretical framework for this presentation, but we will take a closer look later. So a huge challenge that is posed to communication and intercultural communication is the problem of essentialism. So essentialism is the view that certain categories, for example, women or racial groups or migrants, have an underlying reality or true nature that one cannot observe directly. And it's important to avoid essentialism because this often goes together with a metaphor of roots and cultural roots, and it often underlies assumptions of territoriality and even forms of nationalism. So the language and culture nexus and continuum is never stable. It is characterized by dynamics and negotiability in all negotiative and communicative processes. So we should never have a comparative approach towards these encounters, because it doesn't work. And it is necessary to focus on the actual interaction that is taking place and not take into account these types of biases and prejudices when it comes to intercultural communication. And this also relates to hate speech, which is the UN defines it as any kind of communication in speech or writing or behavior that uses pejorative or discriminative language in regards to a person or group on the basis of who they are. For example, religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent. And similarly, stereotypes are beliefs about individuals or groups that are often overgeneralized, inaccurate, and resistant to change. For instance, teachers of a class might have a stereotypical view of how immigrants from certain countries look or behave, and expect all individuals from the same background to act and behave in the same way without any knowledge of them as people. And public attitudes matter because they affect migrants and refugees' sense of belonging in their host country and their well-being and their chances of becoming well integrated and settle in successfully. So having an essentialist concept of a culture might completely block this process and block our understanding of what happens in a concrete form of interaction. So what I was talking about before, the others are conceptualized as a threat in both physical and symbolic sense. And we will take a better look at examples of such hate speech and stereotyping when it comes to TCNs in the second part of this presentation. So just to close this off, and we will have a small break after this, is the way that we have interpreted and wish to express the principles of intercultural communication in the context of TCN integration might be different from what one might initially expect when going into this presentation. So in our view, interculturalism implies a situation founded on a willingness, so to want to study and to know the appropriation of cultural models that belong to others, but are considered more valid than one's own. In contrast to just a multicultural setting where we aim only for tolerance and respect, but not going beyond our way to want to study and learn about these, the ways of being involved in a discussion and willing to mutually influence each other through intercultural communication encounters. And you can see that one discovers other points of views and other ways of conceptualizing reality and other ways of life when they engage in interculturalism. So with this, I would like to close off the first part of our presentation. We'll take a quick 15-minute, 20-minute break and come back with more practical considerations and implications of what I have presented in this theoretical framework. So we can just pause the recording here and come back in a bit. So, να κάνω ένα share screen. Oh, sorry, no λεπτάκι. Ξανακάνω ένα share screen. Okay, so as we have seen so far with what I have said is that a big challenge to society members in general, but also to TCNs is having to deal with institutional and the bureaucratic world. So an intercultural communication approach was chosen for DREAM workshops and activities because it is part of everyday life, and because if not mastered properly, it may represent an obstacle to becoming active citizens. And this is a skill that is not offered often in training or when one begins to volunteer or work with TCN's integration, and it is what is unique to the DREAM project. So communication problems are almost entirely due to prejudice or misinformation and stereotypes, or maybe due to the fact that one does not put enough effort into understanding intercultural communication. Maybe because there's also not adequate training or policies or actions that facilitate a smoother learning environment with mutual exchanges between trainers and TCNs. And especially when it comes to the bureaucratic and institutional world and situations, TCNs have often very frequent communication problems. So I chose to present to you two stories from TCNs in Cyprus. I will show you, I don't remember how long this video is. It's quite long. Maybe you can watch it on your own time because it's 7 minutes. But basically this is a story of Mohammed and Dimitrina. who got married in 2011. Mohammed is from Bangladesh, and he received the residence permit that lasted until 2017. And they both have a daughter together, and they were arrested in 2013 because the public authorities.
They all have a daughter together.
And they have a daughter together.
Τώρα πήγαμε σε υιοθεσίες.
Ναι. And basically they got arrested in 2013 because the public authorities kept insisting that this was a fake marriage, and that Mohammed was just trying to enter Cypriot society for his own benefit and to get benefits and work in Cyprus without actually having a legal or proper reason to do so. So he fake married Dimitrina. So they sent both of them to a camp, like a detention camp. And from what I know, from what the video says, I'm not sure if this is updated information. They were still there until a couple of years ago, and they wouldn't allow them to see their daughter as well. So their daughter was taken to social welfare services and taken by to be protected by other people. So this was just an unfair instance of discrimination and prejudice towards Mohammed. They assumed that he married Dimitrina just to get an EU passport, even though there was never proof of it. So in the video, you can see testimonials of people saying that we always see them together and they're always happy with their child. So like the public authorities were just making up conspiracies just to deny him his yellow slip. So we can see active public authorities discrimination towards them. And you can see that they did not have a proper way of communicating with him and listening to him and his story. They would refuse to properly investigate the situation, and they instantly assumed that this would be a fake marriage. And in the second testimonial I have provided is regarding an Afghan refugee who arrived in Cyprus and who he was trying to get a job through the asylum service and the social welfare office. And it describes the ways that he was communicating with these bureaucratic institutions. And you can see that they were also talking to him in a very rude manner and assuming that he would, I don't know, he would be up to do all the kinds of jobs that maybe they would pay him like two euros per hour or something, just because he was an Afghan refugee. And he was finding out that other people were doing the same job that he was offered for like a double pay. And he describes instances where he was talking on the telephone with them and they were discriminating against him. So you can also watch this on your own time and kind of get to understand, if you don't already know, how these people are treated, often within public and bureaucratic institutions. So what can we deduce from these videos? And you can also think about this when you actually watch them, but you can see that there's an issue in establishing proper communication when it comes to bureaucratic communication and TCNs. And this is largely evident due to the presence of stereotypes and prejudices from public officials towards those TCNs. And we have here clear episodes of institutional racism, and officials are making false assumptions about each person's status or situation just because of who they are and where they come from. And you can observe that they are not able or willing to listen or understand their situation, despite the fact that they are reaching out for help to them in order to better integrate into the country. They're looking for jobs. They're looking for ways to belong in the whole society, and they are deserving of it, but public officials do not seem to, they just put up walls and falsely assume that they are one way when they are not. So as dream mentors, lead mentors, your job will be to help mentors and TCNs to overcome these kinds of encounters through helping them understand the culture better and helping them learn the language so that they can speak with them in more clear ways. So the better you know the language, the better the communication will be, because they will also appreciate that the TCNs know their language, so they will more possibly be less rude to them. And through the interventions that will happen, such as the workshops on how to build a good CV, will also help them to structure their applications better. And the joint community actions will also help them facilitate mutual exchanges with them and to better prepare them for such situations in real life. And also learn about the language and technical skills that is needed that will significantly diminish these negative situations where there's a negative treatment by these institutions. And this will happen through both coaching your mentors, but also through organizing these workshops that will directly help TCNs. So in these videos give rise to two important elements that we would like to explore further that I have mentioned in the previous presentation. The first one is hate speech and hate communication, and the second one is regarding bureaucratic and institutional communication. Since I've already started to mention stereotypes and hate speech from before, I will continue with that, and then we will move on to the process of filling forms later on. So in mainstream media, but in Cyprus, but also generally, we see that there is a regular use of hate speech, especially against migrants and refugees. And the use of discriminatory speech in social media is often uncontrollable. And different language, habits, and appearance become grounds for expressing racist behaviors and hate speech in Cyprus, unfortunately. In Cyprus especially, racism has a class dimension. So you will often see that wealthy immigrants are not seen as, you're not going to see them having negative encounters. You will see that they are more welcome in the Greek Cypriot society, in contrast to those who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, even if they still come from the same country and have the same color and same cultures as the wealthy immigrants. So if you have an investor coming in from Pakistan, the Cypriot authorities will not treat them the same way as one from Pakistan, but from a lower background. So what is often the case is that
generally, in
general
terms. It depends to the person. I mean, even between us, amongst the authorities as well. I think this is mostly dependent on the person, how they will reinforce, react, and act on this. So,
and this is not to say that all public authorities are like that. I mean, yes.
Ακριβώς, το ξεκαθαρίσουμε αυτό, αλλά βλέποντας συμβαίνει με βάση τις έρευνες.
Μπράβο, βάσει έρευνες εν απλά ότι υπάρχουν αρκετά από τούτα τα situations, ας πούμε, που έγιναν recorded, ας πούμε, και it's worth mentioning them.
Και από πολίτες βέβαια γίνεται, να το πούμε και τούτο, ας πούμε, στο event που είχαμε το Σάββατο, πολλά από τα άτομα που εγγραφτήκαν τα είχα είπα μου το comment, ότι ξέρω εγώ, είμαστε πάρα πολλά χαρούμενοι που μας μιλάτε, είσαστε ανοιχτοί, προσπαθείτε να μας βοηθήσετε, αλλά από πολλούς, ας πούμε, Κύπριους, δηλαδή ακούσαμε τα παράπονα.
Εννοείται. Και τούτον έρχεται και από τα social media, ας πούμε, επειδή υπάρχει πάρα πολύ misinformation και τον που ήθελα να πω τώρα, ότι πολλές φορές, ας πούμε, να χρησιμοποιήσουν τους TCNs, τους migrants, τους refugees, για να πούν ότι, ξέρεις, τσίνη φταίει για τα οικονομικά μας προβλήματα ή ότι, ας πούμε, τούτοι φταίνε επειδή έχουμε rising unemployment, ας πούμε. Οπότε, τούτα τα attitudes κάνουν seep into our general culture, ας πούμε, και αρκεύει και περισσότερος κόσμος να τα πιστεύει, και ακόμα και αν είναι αβάσιμα, ας πούμε, δηλαδή, απλώς επειδή ακούνται περισσότερο, τόσο πιο πολλά ο κόσμος μπορεί να τα πιστέψει, και το ίδιο και για τα public authorities σε bureaucratic institutions, ας πούμε, που να κάνουν deal μαζί με TCNs directly ή indirectly. Οπότε είναι πολύ σημαντικός ο τρόπος που γίνονται portraits στα media τούτοι ανθρώποι, γιατί επηρεάζουν μεγάλων ποσοστών της κοινωνίας. Και φαίνεται ότι ο ΚΙΣΑ έκαμε μια έρευνα το 2019 and it says that migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, all those people belonging in those groups are portrayed as abusers of social assistance, so that basically that they are lazy and they don't want to work and they only want to get help by the state and receive the benefits from the state, and they're not real refugees, they're just taking advantage of the system, which is basically a whole series of misinformation, because you can see, like, with proof that there are people coming from countries that they are seeking asylum because they're, you know, fleeing war or fleeing natural disasters or whatever. And you see that this is not the case. It's just a way of portraying them to just, I don't know, see them as, use them as scapegoats for other societal problems that have nothing to do with them. So you can see that racism and xenophobia and discrimination are on the rise in Cyprus, and politicians often make regular use of this kind of hate speech just because they try to maybe communicate their failed attempts at improving societal issues, and using them to say that, oh, it's they are undocumented and illegal immigrants. Δεν είναι παράνομοι λαθρομετανάστες, ας πούμε. Ενώ this is despite the fact that hate speech is actually a criminal offense in Cyprus. So people still use these kinds of phrases, even though under the legislation of Cypriot law, it's actually illegal to express racism and xenophobia.
Νομίζω όσο μορφωμένος ή μη μορφωμένος και να είσαι, ό,τι background και να έχει ένα σπίτι, στην Κύπρο, ναι, η αλήθεια πολλά, έτσι, ό,τι γίνει εν τούτη...
Φταίνει οι μετανάστες. Ναι.
Ναι, η αλήθεια νομίζω είναι έχει σπίτι μια άτομο και από εμάς, ας πούμε, είμαστε στο project, θέλουμε να βοηθήσουμε και από μορφωμένα άτομα που στον περίγυρο μας, είτε και από συγγενείς, φίλους, γνωστούς, να ακούσαμε, υπάρχει σε Κυπρέους και να μην ακούσουμε πάνω από κάποιον, φταίουν τούτοι που ήρθαν.
Ναι, 100%.
Δεν ξέρω φυσικά στις άλλες χώρες
νομίζω είναι παντού.
Είναι αρκετά common, εντάξει, εμείς μιλούμε για τούτα που ξέρουμε, για το είμαστε σίγουροι ότι...
Και εδώ ήθελα να δείξω έτσι κάποια παραδείγματα από actual social media, ας πούμε, τούτον από την Ελλάδα. Εν παράδειγμα του πώς, ας πούμε, μια εφημερίδα ή ένα blog μπορεί να παρουσιάσει, ας πούμε, τους λαθρομετανάστες, ότι μπαίνουν παράνομα. Η χρήση των λέξεων παράνομοι και λαθρομετανάστες, ας πούμε, είναι σωστό λεξιλόγιο, είναι σωστό terminology, ας πούμε, που πρέπει να χρησιμοποιείται για τις περιπτώσεις τους, γιατί αν είναι asylum seekers οι άνθρωποι, είναι ούτε παράνομοι ούτε λαθρομετανάστες, κάνουν φλή από μια χώρα που έχει κάποιον πόλεμο, κάνουν φλή από κάποιο συγκεκριμένο πρόβλημα. Οπότε πρέπει να τους βλέπουμε ως παρανόμους. Απλά το ότι δεν έχουν τα χαρτιά τους δεν είναι επειδή είναι παρανόμοι άνθρωποι. Απλώς ότι εφίαν από κάπου που δεν είχα χρόνο. Με να πιάσει το πιστοποιητικό γέννησης τους, με το διαβατήριο τους, την ταυτότητα τους. Ενώ έχει πάρα πολλούς λόγους γιατί κάποιος να φύγει από τη χώρα του για να πάει αλλού. Και επίσης, ακόμα ένα παραδείγμα είναι το που είναι και λίγο shocking at the same time, που ο διευθυντής Λυκείου στη Λευκοσία, μάλιστα, έδιωξε μαθήτρια που φορέ μαντήλα. Απλώς επειδή είναι μουσουλμάνα η κοπέλα, ας πούμε, ενώ τα πράγματα πλέον νομίζω είναι απαράδεκτα, είναι κάτι που το γενική κοινωνία νομίζω είναι κάτι που γίνεται tolerated. Αλλά υπάρχουν τα instances of discrimination, ας πούμε, και το terminology που χρησιμοποιείται για τους ανθρώπους είναι πολλά λάθος. Ή, ας πούμε, έχει ακόμα ένα παράδειγμα που το Social Welfare Services στην Κύπρο του 2019 που έχει γραφτεί. Έχει και ένα βίντεο για το συγκεκριμένο, αλλά επειδή είναι έτσι λίγο disturbing βίντεο, δεν ήθελα να το βάλω, να το δούμε. Αλλά είναι μια κοπέλα από τη Σομαλία που είχε πάει στο γραφείο Τζαμέ και έχει recording, ας πούμε, βίντεο που γίνεται abused, ας πούμε, physically abused που το reception Τζαμέ.
Physically, verbally.
Και τα θκιο, ας πούμε, κούντισαν την, εφώναζαν της, έφτιαχναν την, έπιαν την ποσέρι να τη θκιώξει. Και βασικά πήγαινε η κοπέλα να ζητήσει κάτι και έκαναν deny το request της, ας πούμε, πριν καν να το ακούσουν. Και έπιασε την που το sharing και έπιασε την και που το λεμόν, ας πούμε, και έφτιαξε την. Ενώ εν τούτα τα situations, ας πούμε, που είσαι κάπως γίνεται να γίνονται ακόμα τα πράγματα. Και ειδικά σε bureaucratic institutions, ενώ είναι αρκετά deep το πρόβλημα. Και I wanted to talk about the use of these kinds of terminologies, like illegal, undocumented λαθρομετανάστες, which is very harmful to what we stand for and what we should stand for. And according to UNHCR, it's legally incorrect because being undocumented does not constitute a crime in most countries, and it's misleading because they have lost their status through exploitation most of the times, and disinformation and administrative delays, and not by committing an offense. And it ignores international legal obligations to call them that. It violates principles of due process. It's dehumanizing to them because it denies their dignity and their human rights as a person. It is criminalizing because it depicts them as dishonest people and undeserving criminals, for example. Is discriminatory to them because this is used in a negative term only for migrants and not like general citizens. And it is a very oppressive and outdated terminology to use. For this case, it is no longer an accepted term to describe those without proper documentation. And it does not adhere to EU values of the 21st century. So use of specific words in such encounters or through the bureaucratic institutions and the system sets the progress miles back when you use such a language to describe their situation, because it prevents them from having a fair debate, from having solidarity towards them, and undermines general social cohesion amongst these groups and how citizens view them from the day that they arrive until generally they're staying in the host country. So therefore, this is just so that you're aware of such instances, and that when you encounter TCNs and when you train your mentors, you need to be aware of the kinds of harmful terminologies that exist out there, both in Cyprus and generally abroad. And you should know that they're frequently expressed, but you should try to combat them and make sure that you never use anything like that, even by accident. It's really not how they should be treated. I have a small video for you to watch. It's a few words by refugees themselves. It's a 1-minute video, so I will show it to you.
People think we are here by our choice, but actually we're forced to flee.
People think I live in a luxury house with my children, but I live in a rat-infested house.
People think I live in a big house, but in reality, I'm homeless.
People think we're here for benefits, but in reality, we're here for safety.
People think we are here for the education, but reality, our children can't even go to university.
People think we are criminals, but in reality, we are running away from the criminal.
So yes, I think this is a perfect representation of how these people are treated and what people's views are towards them. So what you think about them might not might not represent their actual situation. So through intercultural communication, it's possible to counter these kinds of narratives in order to avoid these people's misrepresentation through the media, through different encounters, especially the use of negative stereotypes of certain individuals or communities. So knowledge about one's culture and norms, it can foster respect for necessary for community building and help correct these incorrect messages that are being portrayed about ethnic communities in social media and other platforms. And in the video below, which is from Amnesty International, I'm not going to show it now because it's like a 5-minute video, but they conducted a 4-minute experiment with Europeans and refugees where they sat across from each other and looked each other in the eyes for 4 minutes. This is something that we did also with C.I.P. during a training. And the results are very moving, so that you see that during those 4 minutes, you see very reactions that are shocking, and you see, people crying without even talking to each other. It's just their body gestures and their facial expressions, no words. But as time passes and they just get to know each other through their eyes, you see very emotional reactions. You see them start whispering and talking to each other and getting to know each other better. Whilst in the beginning, they're just, two strangers staring at each other. And it's very important because, the longer you get to know each other and the longer you take a look at them in, literally or like symbolically, by taking the time to look into their situations and understand them, the better the communication is between the groups that are involved in those encounters. So it's a very moving video. You should take time to view it when you want to, because it's really amazing what they have done here. And so I wanted to go into a bit of more practical information for you that you can use it in your own encounters, just to be able to make sure that how you're speaking to either your mentors or your TCNs, to make sure that you're doing it correctly, according to a standard set by the UNHCR when having to do with asylum seekers and refugees. So in order to establish this mutual respect between the two parties who are communicating, you should always try to make the other person feel comfortable, whether you're teaching them a language, whether you're having a workshop with them to teach them something else, in all kinds of situations. So you should always aim to build trust and safety in the environment that you're working in. And when advising your mentors on how to have direct and even intimate conversations with TCNs, we suggest these practical tips for you. The first one is regarding speech. So you should always speak clearly, and the speech should always be clearly audible, but not loud, not too loud. You should always have warmth of tone in your voice. And it also needs to vary depending on the situation in order to reflect the different feelings and emotional tones of their messages, and always have a moderate speech space. In terms of physical space, when you're in closer encounters with TCNs, just try to keep like at least half a meter distance between your chairs or your bodies. And in terms of body language, you should always try to be moderately expressive when it comes to your arms and hands, your movements, not too quick movements and not too extravagant movements, and make appropriate gestures. You know what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. You should try to have your body leaning slightly forward so that you let them know that I'm listening to you, but not too close to make them feel uncomfortable. Convey attentiveness, that you are paying attention to them, but also feel relaxed, like you shouldn't feel tense about your interactions, and be physically on the same level. So sit, like not have different levels when you're sitting or standing. And always, this is a very important rule, is to avoid any overly informal language or alienating language, such as you and your people or something like that. Also avoid prolonged silences, just to avoid feelings of, being uncomfortable. Also avoid excessively animated speech and slow, rapid, and broken speech patterns. Just try to keep a consistent way of talking to them and be calm, and avoid speaking inaudibly or mumble so that they can understand you better when you're talking. So just be clear, not too slow, not too fast. Just try to have this in mind because it will definitely help the way they are perceived by you.
Πάει Βασιλική. Τι είναι το μάμπο? Μάμπο.
Yeah.
Πες μάμπο.
Mumble. Like έτσι, να μιλάς που κάτω από τα δόντια, ας πούμε, να μην είναι καθαρό το...
Εμείς λίγο φυσικά νομίζω, δηλαδή τα αγγλικά που μιλώ με κάποιους που δεν ξέρουν αγγλικά, τα αγγλικά που μιλούσα τα Σαββάτια, δεν ήταν τα βασικά, γιατί αν δεις ότι δεν ξέρει καλά αγγλικά, και να του μιλάς με ορολογίες και με τις λέξεις, να μιλάς όσο πιο απλά.
Αλλά ακόμα και κάποια πράγματα που νομίζεις ότι είναι απλά για σένα, ας πούμε, μπορεί να μην είναι απλά για εσένα. Οπότε εντάξει, καθαρίζει που το level του καθένας.
Και το μάμπο.
Επίσης, φάνηκε κάποιες φορές ότι όταν διαβάζουν κάτι μπορούν να το καταλάβουν καλύτερα από ότι όταν τους το λες. Δηλαδή, άμα οι λέξεις που χρησιμοποιείς είναι απλές, αλλά διαβάζονται σαν να τις ακούν.
Ναι, εκτός αν δεν ξέρουν τη γλώσσα.
Ναι, ενώ για το level των αγγλικών, ας πούμε, ότι κάποιες φορές στα αγγλικά, άμα δουν κάτι γραμμένο, μπορεί να το καταλάβουν καλύτερα.
Ναι, ισχύει. Ναι. Επειδή, ας πούμε, μπορεί να τους ακούεται άλλος πώς, ενώ αν το σκευάσουν, μπορεί να το ξέρουν με άλλον τρόπο, σε ακουστικό.
Μπορεί και δική μας η προφορά να αυτή κάποιες φορές. Αφού και εμείς, ας πούμε, όσοι τους μιλούν, έχουν προφορά κυπριακή, αγγλική, αμερικάνικη, ενώ...
Ναι, παίζει ρόλο φουλ. Ας πούμε το youth, να μου είναι. Ναι, okay. So I will move on to bureaucratic and institutional communication with a few more examples. So different text formats that you may find in these kinds of situations are generally forms that you need to fill in during the integration process. Maybe instructions on how to fill those forms is a frequent thing to see in institutional communication. We see information of general interest that might be given to TCNs. They often have to read or write official mail to public institutions or from public institutions. They will have some contact with bills, whether that is from their living environments or elsewhere. They will also need they will encounter at some point invoices and receipts and tickets. So it is important to understand what kinds of practical challenges there are when encountering these different written formats in texts. So when it comes to the verbal side and the linguistic side, we see that oftentimes these kinds of forms consist of specialist bureaucratic terms, formulation and sentence construction, which are not used in everyday life and everyday encounters. So these are more technical terms that you will not find anywhere else. And these are also not taught in second language acquisition classes most of the time, because it's not something that one will talk about in, out of nowhere in a conversation. And they also cannot be easily acquired through, formal or informal education. For example, through the internet or through their social experiences with others or reading something or self-reading. And also when it comes to forms to fill in and bills and invoices, these pose problems, especially on the visual side, because they also, usually they do not follow a single format. So there's no standard format when it comes to filling in these forms. Sometimes, for example, the surname is first and the name is second, or vice versa. And this may cause problems in regards to not knowing how to answer this very basic section of the form. In terms of cultural peculiarities, the distinction between the name and the surname and how to deal with names might be complicated for some people because it's different from country to country. Also, some people don't know their exact date of birth, depending on where they come from and what their situation is. So these are like practical challenges that these people might face when filling in this information, and lead mentors need to specify this information to their mentors in order to help them understand that during these kinds of interactions and workshops with TCNs, they need to establish a framework where the learners, the TCNs will explain what they know but do not understand and what they do not know at all, and help them fill in the forms step by step, and at the same time also learn from each other through the process. And sometimes you will find like that a simple translation of the text, for example, in a third language, just to understand the text better, will not resolve the problem because the forms are more complex, and due to the bureaucratic procedures and concepts these are different from country to country. So translations may not work at all. Our Maltese partners provided an example of a form that this is specifically for Malta, but it's in English. And this is for immigrants arriving in Malta that they need to fill in. And this is a relatively complex form from a syntactical point of view. And you can see an example of how this can be a difficulty for these people who may not even know the language that is used, or the way that it's presented might not help them answer it properly. I also used some Cypriot examples. This is a form that is used for domestic workers in Cyprus. You will see that it's a lot of information on like a couple of pages. They need to know also very specific information that
this is the same document as with Malta.
No, this is specifically for domestic workers. For Malta, it was for generally immigrants, but it's just a small part of it, I guess. It's not the whole form. This is a whole form for domestic workers, among other things that they need to fill in. This is just the official
form. Is it given to them in other languages as well?
I'm not sure. Here it's just Cypriot and English underneath, but I didn't see an option where this was provided in other languages on the official Ministry of Interior website.
I think this for Vasiliki is very important, and for the purposes of DREAM, maybe if we can't find this in other languages, for the lessons to be more practical, after they learn some basics in the last modules, or some brochures or some things that we can have in the one-stop shop, it's maybe some explanations of basic terminology of these forms.
Yeah.
It's extremely complicated even seeing it.
Yes, it's tiring to the eye. So imagine someone who doesn't know the language well and doesn't know some of these details, how to answer them. Or maybe
probably the employer or another person does it for them.
But maybe they don't know their addresses or their full names, and there's not a lot of space to specify different stuff. It's just ticks or very small sections. So it's a bit too busy. And also I have provided a form for recognized refugees, and for those who are seeking asylum. And what struck me very much here is that here they use the word alien. So they actually use the word allodapos in the language, even though it's no longer accepted in this case. And in domestic workers, they use just third country national. So I don't know. I mean, the framework in which this is developed is very different from the domestic workers, and they also have much more forms to fill in this case, as I saw on the website. And you can also click those links afterwards and see the kinds of things that they need to fill in. And this is useful because in the language classes, for example, or in the workshops, you can have a workshop where you show them all the kinds of forms, depending on what their status is, if they are domestic workers, if they are asylum seekers, etc. And you can ask them to tell you, what does this mean? And, have sessions where you just explain to them so that they know how to fill them in, or just show them generally like kinds of bills that they're going to encounter in their daily life. Maybe show them how to construct an email to a public service, exactly how to structure it and what kinds of words to use. So this is very important information that they will need to learn at some point if they want to be fully integrated into society. And as you can see, generally these forms are framed in a very legalistic manner, which is not something that you learn in typical, language classes or other workshops. And they require them to fill in the forms in a genre-specific way, which creates very many inequalities, especially in the asylum procedure, which is very heavy. And the use of words such as alien and allodapos, etc., it just reinforces the othering process. So in these different texts, we have different kinds of forms of interaction. This can include through front office interactions. So when you go to a public office and you just talk to the receptionist or to a public official, you have service encounters. Maybe you go to ask to get an ID number, or I don't know, a driver's license. You have police encounters, which is a very frequent thing with TCNs. You have doctor-patient interactions, and you also have help desk interactions. And in your workshops, you can build on your experiences and what I have shown you so far to help mentors and TCNs to understand the different kinds of communicative encounters and the different ways that you deal with each encounter. Because when you go to the doctor, you will not speak the same way as you will speak to, the police. So they need to be able to differentiate between the ways that they will speak to different bureaucratic institutions. So they should be better able to understand them and be prepared for them. There are also different verbal elements when it comes to spoken interaction that you and your mentors and the TCNs themselves will need to identify. So they should be able to tell whether different words are pronounced completely or not, whether sentences, when someone speaks to you, if they complete the sentence or if they interrupted the sentence, when there are reformulations in the text, in the spoken interaction, if the person makes pauses, they change their volume, they change their speed, they make particular emphasis or stresses when they're saying something, maybe their voice is they're raising their voice, or their voice is falling. So you need to be able to differentiate between these different ways of speaking and then communicate this to them so that they will be able to understand it as well. When it comes to nonverbal elements, we need to also understand facial expressions, eye contact, movements, gestures, direction of the eyes, the posture one has, the kinds of physical contact that occurs. So often when it comes to nonverbal communication, this reflects what we feel. So it is important to be able to read one's body language and be aware of one's body language. And because it's important that when you're, for example, if there's a change in the speaker's facial expression, this allows you to understand what they're feeling and what they're talking about. And, just maybe explain something. So for example, if you're speaking to a TCN and they start to have like a puzzled look and you observe this, you use this to make a pause and understand them and make an intervention, or take a pause and say, okay, let's go through this again. So, each observation you make is valuable for yourself and for them in this case. So all these methods and elements need to be seen always in context and according to the situation. You will not always act the same way in all encounters, of course, and all of these elements have a strong impact on one's perception and feelings when it comes to interpretation. And if, you should always remember that if the first impact is negative, with you and your mentors or you and TCNs, you will see that this might cause anxiety to them, might disturb the general communication that you will have later on. So just make sure to be aware of this, of these things, and self-reflect while you're doing, while you're having these encounters, just to make sure that nothing is going wrong. Here I provided some more advice on, being able to analyze the conversation. You can view this later on. I don't want to take much of your time. Just a few important considerations that are, some are self-explanatory, but you should always, you should never use, you should never think that you need to have scientific competencies in the field of linguistics to know these kind of things, to make these kinds of analysis when you're speaking or writing something. It's just only becoming aware of these things will make it easier for you and the TCNs to understand where communication problems may occur and how to overcome them. European forms are often very unintelligible, and it might be chaotic for TCNs who are coming from countries that are technologically less developed. Many people come from countries where the forms are very simple. You just give 5 things, five information about yourself, and that's it. And in other countries, the amount of data and characters used is huge, like as you have seen with Cyprus. So people, might not take the time to read all of them and understand them better, because the texts are so long. And some terms such as tax code might mean different things to different people. It might be different from someone coming from the Togo in West Africa who may not have a tax code, and someone coming from, Germany. And also the thing that we said about using the surname and the surname and name in different orders might also be confusing to them. And generally, when it comes to these kinds of interactions, we have observed through the case studies that I showed you that there are many ways to have misunderstandings, and public operators often have a difficulty in, establishing successful communication and explaining to them. So it is easy to, have obstacles to communication. The vocabulary used in forms is often difficult, or in spoken interactions. And, if you don't notice this and help prevent this, communication will also be unsuccessful. Often it is the case that TCNs go to public offices and they ask too much information of one person that might not be able to answer those information for them. So, this might also become a problem. They should always know where to go for what, and just ask for the necessary information that don't go beyond the competencies of someone, because if this often happens and maybe someone gets angry about this and they're like, no, I'm not responsible for this, go away. So they might be rude to them if they ask too many things of them and they don't know how to answer. And when it comes to asylum seekers applications, we see that public service institutions often expect them to have a lot of information and unnecessary information. For example, they ask them details about the types of cars that they drove, and brand names, and different addresses, and other people's names, and like their whole names, precise times that they left the boat from the harbor. This is information that any normal person can, not remember. So these kinds of literary narrative tactics are requiring them to remember things in a particular way, even though they may not be able to remember all of this. And they expect them to speak and remember information in a variety of ways. And they should learn these competencies slowly, because they will be asked to narrate their stories or different situations in different manners. So sometimes it may be formal, sometimes it may be informal, sometimes it will be friendly. So they need to be able to also know how to do this once they start learning the language better. So this is a very important tip that lead mentors and mentors need to know in order just to be able to get their rights and benefits properly. So I think I've exhausted the whole topic. Just a nice and inspiring quote I read here.
Exhausted the topic, exhausted yourself.
Yes, exhausted myself and everyone else.
Exhausted.
Yes, so thank you for following with me. I hope this is useful. You know, you can take your time and do the links and videos. Everything is very useful when it comes to different encounters that you will have with them. And remember that borders exist between countries and not people. Ναι.
Just to remind you. Να σε παραδεχτώ.
Ιντραντζίντζα. Να τα στείλει.
Δύσκολο.
Από ό,τι ξέρω έτσι. Ναι, πρέπει να ξέρω. Μην το λύσετε. Ναι, σίγουρη. Ναι. Εντάξει, ένα reminder για το επόμενο session στις 30 του μήνα με τη Ραφαέλα μας.
Ένα reminder να συμπληρώσετε τη φόρμα όταν το δείτε.
Ναι. Να είναι πιο interactive activities που έχουν σχέση με το intercultural communication, να είναι πιο practical implementation του τι είπαμε σήμερα. Την Πέμπτη η ώρα 10, be there. Ευχαριστώ που με ακούσατε, ελπίζω να μην σας κούρασα πολλά. Και we will speak again, να σας δω και στο live session, ελπίζω να είσαστε όλοι εκεί για να σας γνωρίσω, επειδή δεν είχα την ευκαιρία να σας γνωρίσω την πρώτη φορά. Ελπίζω να ήταν ενδιαφέρον και να γεμίσετε το participation form. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.